Behind a calm appearance and seeming simplicity was the fate of a man whose decisions changed the course of wars. Abrams gave every one of his tanks the same name, Thunderbolt, and over time soldiers began to believe there was a special power hidden in that choice. His surname became a symbol of the American Army, yet it was also tied to some of the most controversial and difficult pages of history. He earned respect even from enemies, but inside his own army, stories were told in whispers. Harsh orders, secret talks with politicians, accusations of failure, and legends of incredible escapes followed him through his career. For some, he was a savior; for others, a commander whose strategies brought only new troubles. And still, his name was fixed on the main battle tank of the United States, while debates about his legacy continue to this day. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Creighton Williams Abrams Jr. entered this world on September 15, 1914, in Springfield, Massachusetts. The son of a railroad mechanic, he grew up in an America where military service meant honor, duty, and clear lines between right and wrong. Nothing in his modest beginnings suggested he would one day command hundreds of thousands of troops in the world's most complex military theater. Abrams graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, in 1936 and was commissioned in the cavalry. The timing couldn't have been more crucial. He emerged from West Point as the world balanced on the edge of global conflict, when cavalry units were transitioning into mechanized warfare, and when young officers had to learn that modern war demanded more than courage alone. After service with the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Bliss, Texas, he joined the newly created 1st Armored Division and became a captain in 1940. The transformation from horses to tanks mirrored America's own evolution from isolation to global engagement. For Abrams, this wasn't just a career change. It was preparation for a lifetime of adapting to impossible circumstances. His early military years revealed a pattern that would define his entire career. While other officers focused on protocol and paperwork, Abrams gravitated toward the mechanical, the practical, the real. He understood machines because he understood systems, and wars, as he would later prove, are ultimately about systems thinking under extreme pressure. The young officer's reputation grew quietly through countless training exercises and routine assignments. His superiors noted something different about him, a calm intensity that suggested deeper currents of thought. He didn't speak unless he had something worth saying, but when he spoke, people listened. This wasn't the flashy charisma of Hollywood's version of military leadership. This was something rarer and more dangerous: authentic competence combined with unshakable moral conviction. Europe in the 1940s became Abrams' classroom, and the lessons were written in steel and fire. During World War II, Abrams served in the 4th Armored Division, initially as regimental adjutant, battalion commander, and regiment executive officer with the 37th Armor Regiment. But it was what happened next that would forge the legend of Thunderbolt. In September 1943, a reorganization of the division redesignated the 37th Armor Regiment to the 37th Tank Battalion, which Abrams commanded. Command of a tank battalion in Patton's Third Army wasn't just responsibility, it was an invitation to rewrite the manual on armored warfare. The motto of Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion was "Courage Conquers." If ever a unit lived up to its motto, this one did. Abrams led from the front, in the turret of his own tank, which he named Thunderbolt. This wasn't bravado or recklessness. It was calculated leadership. A commander who shared the same risks as his men earned something that orders alone could never command: absolute trust. He usually rode at the head of his columns, standing in the turret and chewing on a cigar. The German army, despite its reputation for military excellence, found itself facing something unexpected in Abrams' battalion. The New York Times reported, "The retreating Germans were said to be fascinated by the relentless advance of these American tankers. What fascinated them was the unprecedented speed of advance combined with tactical flexibility that seemed to anticipate German defensive moves before they were made." He commanded Combat Command B of the division during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate winter offensive that nearly broke the Allied advance. While other units fell back or held defensive positions, Abrams' command became the spearhead of the American counterattack. The forests of the Ardennes witnessed something that would become his signature throughout his career: the ability to maintain offensive momentum even under the worst possible conditions. Abe Abrams wore out 6 tanks, all named Thunderbolt, during the war, but he never had one shot out from under him. 6 tanks destroyed by mechanical stress, enemy action, or the simple wear of constant combat, but never through tactical error or hesitation. Each replacement tank received the same name, as if the word itself carried protective power. His men began to believe that maybe it did. The European theater taught Abrams 3 lessons that would define his approach to command for the rest of his career. First, that speed and surprise could overcome superior numbers and defensive positions. Second, that soldiers fight better when they trust their commander completely. Third, that modern warfare demanded constant adaptation. The tactics that worked yesterday might prove fatal tomorrow. By war's end, he was entitled to wear the French fourragère as a member of the 4th Armored Division. But more importantly, he had earned something that couldn't be pinned to a uniform: the reputation as the type of commander that other commanders wanted to serve under. George Patton called him a world champion tank commander, praise that carried weight in an army full of aggressive, talented officers. The transition from war to peace proved more challenging for many officers than combat itself. After years of clear objectives and decisive action, the post-war army struggled with budget cuts, unclear missions, and the growing complexity of Cold War geopolitics. For Abrams, however, this period became an opportunity to study the changing nature of warfare itself. He served in Korea from 1953 during the war's final phases and aftermath. Korea presented a different kind of challenge, a conflict where political objectives remained murky, where victory meant something other than unconditional surrender, where the enemy fought with different rules and expectations. These lessons would prove invaluable 20 years later in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The 1950s and early 60s saw Abrams moving through increasingly important staff positions and commands. He was promoted to the rank of general in 1964. But promotion in the peacetime army meant more than just increased responsibility. It meant grappling with the fundamental questions about America's role in the world and the military's role in American society. During these years, Abrams developed the intellectual framework that would guide his later decisions in Vietnam. He studied insurgency warfare, analyzed the French experience in Indochina, and absorbed the lessons of other contemporary conflicts. While many American officers remained focused on conventional warfare against the Soviet Union, Abrams recognized that future conflicts would likely be messier, more complex, and less susceptible to traditional military solutions. His reputation grew not through dramatic gestures or public relations campaigns, but through the quiet respect of fellow professionals who recognized exceptional competence. Other officers sought his opinions on complex problems, knowing that Abrams brought a unique combination of combat experience and analytical thinking to every discussion. The Cold War Army was, in many ways, an army preparing for the wrong war. Training focused on massive tank battles across European plains, nuclear scenarios, and traditional state versus state conflict. Abrams understood this paradigm, but also recognized its limitations. He spent considerable time studying guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency theory, and the political dimensions of limited conflicts. This intellectual preparation would prove crucial when America found itself committed to a war that fit none of the traditional categories. While other commanders tried to apply World War II lessons to Southeast Asian realities, Abrams would bring a more nuanced understanding of how military force interacted with political objectives in complex, culturally unfamiliar environments. Creighton Abrams commanded military operations in the Vietnam War from 1968 to 1972. But the story of how he got there reveals as much about American strategy as about the man himself. When Lyndon Johnson needed a new commander for Military Assistance Command Vietnam, he didn't choose the loudest voice or the most politically connected general. He chose the most competent. The year 1968 had been a disaster for American strategy in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, while a military defeat for North Vietnamese forces, had been a strategic victory that fundamentally altered American public perception of the war. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition, measuring success by body counts and territory temporarily occupied, had produced impressive statistics but failed to achieve decisive results. Abrams became the architect of the one war strategy, a fundamental reimagining of how American forces would engage in Southeast Asia. Where Westmoreland had focused on large-scale search and destroy operations designed to find and eliminate enemy forces, Abrams recognized that Vietnam required a more sophisticated approach that acknowledged the war's political and social dimensions. The new commander inherited a situation that would have challenged any military leader in history. American public support for the war was collapsing. The South Vietnamese government remained unstable and often ineffective, and the enemy had demonstrated an ability to sustain massive casualties while maintaining strategic initiative. Previous strategies had failed not because they were poorly executed, but because they addressed the wrong problems. Abrams brought to Vietnam the same systematic thinking that had characterized his approach to armored warfare in Europe. But instead of focusing purely on military solutions, he recognized that success in Vietnam would require coordinating military action with political development, economic assistance, and social reform. This wasn't just a change in tactics. It was a fundamental shift in how America approached irregular warfare. The strategy that emerged under Abrams' command became known as Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces, while American troops shifted toward advisory and support roles. Critics argued this was simply a face-saving measure designed to facilitate American withdrawal, but the reality was more complex. Abrams genuinely believed that South Vietnamese forces could become effective with proper training, equipment, and leadership development. This approach required a different kind of American commander, someone who could work effectively with foreign allies, understand cultural nuances, and balance military objectives with political realities. The tank commander who had charged through the Ardennes had evolved into something rarer in the American military tradition, a soldier diplomat capable of strategic thinking across multiple domains simultaneously. The transformation of American military strategy under Abrams represented one of the most significant doctrinal shifts in modern warfare. Where previous commanders had relied on overwhelming firepower and massive troop concentrations, Abrams developed an approach that emphasized precision, mobility, and integration with South Vietnamese forces. The contrast with previous strategies became evident immediately. Westmoreland's search and destroy operations typically involved large American units sweeping through areas suspected of enemy activity, engaging in firefights, and then withdrawing to base camps. These operations generated impressive body counts, but failed to provide lasting security for South Vietnamese civilians or deny territory to enemy forces. Abrams replaced this approach with what military analysts would later recognize as an early form of modern counterinsurgency doctrine. Instead of focusing primarily on eliminating enemy soldiers, American forces began concentrating on disrupting enemy logistics, protecting civilian populations, and supporting South Vietnamese government development programs. The new strategy required American forces to operate in smaller units, maintain closer contact with local populations, and coordinate closely with South Vietnamese military and civilian authorities. This was more demanding for individual soldiers and required higher levels of training and cultural awareness than previous approaches. Intelligence became central to Abrams's operational philosophy in ways that previous commanders had not fully appreciated. Rather than relying primarily on signals intelligence and aerial reconnaissance, American units began developing sophisticated networks of local informants and integrating intelligence gathering with civic action programs. Special operations forces, which had played relatively minor roles under previous commanders, became crucial elements of Abrams's strategy. These units could operate with the precision and cultural sensitivity required for successful counterinsurgency while maintaining the capacity for direct action against high-value targets. The integration of different types of military units, conventional infantry, armor, artillery, aviation, special operations, and support elements, reached unprecedented levels of sophistication under Abrams' command. Previous strategies had often employed these capabilities independently, but Abrams developed operational concepts that maximized their combined effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, Abrams recognized that military success in Vietnam would ultimately depend on the performance of South Vietnamese forces rather than American units. This insight led to a fundamental reorientation of American military effort toward training, advising, and supporting Allied forces, rather than simply replacing them in combat operations. The shift in strategy under Abrams inevitably generated friction with various constituencies who had different expectations for American military performance in Vietnam. These tensions revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of the conflict and the proper role of American military force in achieving political objectives. Congressional critics argued that Abrams' emphasis on gradual Vietnamization and precision operations represented an abandonment of decisive military action. They demanded either massive escalation designed to achieve quick victory or immediate withdrawal of all American forces. The middle path that Abrams advocated satisfied neither extreme position. Military traditionalists within the Army expressed concern that counterinsurgency operations were undermining conventional military skills and readiness for potential conflicts with the Soviet Union. They argued that the American military should focus on its core competencies rather than attempting to become a nation-building force in culturally unfamiliar environments. South Vietnamese government officials often resented American pressure for political and military reforms, viewing such demands as interference in domestic affairs. Simultaneously, they feared that Vietnamization represented American abandonment, disguised as policy evolution. Managing these conflicting concerns required diplomatic skills that few military commanders possessed. American media coverage of the war became increasingly critical as the conflict continued without clear resolution. Journalists who had initially supported American involvement began questioning whether any military strategy could achieve acceptable outcomes given the war's political constraints and the enemy's apparent willingness to sustain unlimited casualties. The most serious criticism came from within the American government itself. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had become deeply skeptical about Vietnam before leaving office, and his successor, Clark Clifford, inherited profound doubts about the entire enterprise. Even supporters of continued American involvement questioned whether Abrams's approach could succeed within acceptable timeframes and casualty levels. International allies, particularly those contributing forces to the conflict, expressed increasing concern about the war's impact on broader American strategic credibility. They worried that Vietnam was consuming resources and attention that should be directed toward containing Soviet expansion in other regions. These multiple layers of criticism created an operational environment unlike anything previous American commanders had experienced. Abrams had to design and implement military strategy while managing complex political relationships with numerous constituencies, many of whom had conflicting objectives and incompatible expectations for American performance. Abrams was Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 1972 until his death in 1974. His appointment to the Army's highest position represented both recognition of his exceptional competence and the institution's need for leadership during a period of fundamental transition. The early 1970s presented the American Army with challenges that went far beyond normal peacetime adjustments. Public confidence in military institutions had been severely damaged by Vietnam. The draft was being eliminated in favor of an all-volunteer force, and defense budgets were being reduced significantly. The Army needed a leader who could navigate these transitions while maintaining institutional effectiveness. He oversaw the transition of the Army to an all-volunteer force. This transformation required more than simply eliminating conscription. It demanded fundamental changes in recruitment, training, compensation, and organizational culture. The volunteer Army would have to attract and retain personnel through incentives rather than legal compulsion, a challenge that many observers doubted could be successfully managed. As Chief of Staff, Abrams demonstrated the same systematic approach to institutional change that had characterized his operational commands. He recognized that the all-volunteer Army would require higher pay, better living conditions, more professional development opportunities, and clearer career progression paths than the conscript forces of previous decades. The transition also required changes in military leadership philosophy and practice. Officers accustomed to commanding conscripted soldiers had to learn how to motivate and retain volunteers who possessed other career options. This shift demanded higher levels of leadership competence throughout the officer corps. At 0035 today, General Creighton W. Abrams, Chief of Staff, United States Army, who had recent Secretary of Defense James R. Schlesinger as an authentic national hero, died at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. The general re-entered the hospital for treatment of complications following earlier surgery to remove a cancerous left lung. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts, General Abrams would have been 60 on September 15th. He had worn his country's uniform for over 42 years, for 4 years as a cadet at West Point, and for 38 years as an Army officer. His death marked the end of an era in American military leadership, the passing of a generation that had commanded through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The timing of Abrams's death was particularly significant. He died just as the American military was beginning to absorb the lessons of Vietnam and develop new doctrinal approaches to future conflicts. His influence on these developments would continue through the officers he had mentored and the institutional changes he had initiated. The decision to name America's main battle tank after Creighton Abrams wasn't simply honorary recognition. It represented the military establishment's acknowledgement that he had fundamentally changed how the Army understood modern warfare. The M1 Abrams tank, introduced in the early 1980s, embodied many of the principles that had guided his approach to military command: mobility, precision, technological sophistication, and adaptability to diverse operational environments. The tank designation process typically honors deceased generals whose contributions significantly influenced military development. Previous American tanks had been named after Civil War commanders like Sherman and Patton, reflecting the Army's historical emphasis on conventional warfare and decisive battles. Choosing Abrams represented recognition that future conflicts would likely resemble Vietnam more than World War II. The M1 Abrams incorporated revolutionary technological advances in fire control, armor protection, and battlefield communications. These capabilities reflected lessons learned from Vietnam about the importance of precision engagement, survivability in complex environments, and integration with other military systems. In many ways, the tank represented the technological evolution of Abrams' tactical philosophy. Within military circles, Abrams became something approaching a legendary figure, but his legend was qualitatively different from those of more flamboyant commanders. While Patton was remembered for aggressive rhetoric and MacArthur for dramatic gestures, Abrams was revered for competence, integrity, and the ability to succeed in impossible situations without compromising professional standards. Young officers studying military history learned about Abrams not through inspiring speeches or memorable quotes, but through careful analysis of how he had adapted military doctrine to meet unprecedented challenges. His example demonstrated that effective military leadership often required qualities that were less dramatic but more fundamental than charismatic inspiration. The Abrams legend also reflected changing American attitudes toward military service and national purpose. Unlike World War II commanders who had fought clearly defined enemies for unambiguous objectives, Abrams had succeeded in Vietnam despite political constraints, unclear objectives, and limited public support. This made him a more relevant model for officers anticipating future conflicts. Military educational institutions began studying Abrams's approach to command as a case study in adaptive leadership under extreme constraints. His methods provided frameworks for thinking about civil-military relations, interagency cooperation, and military operations in politically complex environments. Historical assessment of Abrams' Vietnam command remains contentious among military historians, political scientists, and veterans of the conflict. The fundamental question, whether his strategies could have achieved acceptable outcomes given more time and resources, continues to generate scholarly debate and political controversy. Supporters argue that Abrams's approach represented the only realistic chance for American success in Vietnam. They contend that his emphasis on Vietnamization and precision operations was beginning to achieve measurable progress when American political support collapsed. According to this interpretation, military success was undermined by domestic political failure rather than strategic inadequacy. Critics maintain that Abrams's strategies, while more sophisticated than those of his predecessors, could never have overcome the fundamental political and cultural obstacles to American success in Vietnam. They argue that no military approach could have compensated for the South Vietnamese government's legitimacy problems and the North Vietnamese commitment to unification regardless of casualties. Some analysts have suggested that the debate over Abrams' Vietnam performance reflects broader disagreements about the relationship between military force and political objectives in modern conflicts. His approach anticipated many elements of contemporary counterinsurgency doctrine, but Vietnam may have been an inappropriate testing ground for such methods. The myth-making process around military figures often obscures more than it reveals, and Abrams has not been immune to this tendency. Some accounts have portrayed him as a military genius who could have won Vietnam if not for political interference, while others have dismissed him as simply a more competent manager of an unwinnable situation. More balanced assessments recognize that Abrams inherited an extraordinarily complex situation with no clear path to success. His achievements lay not in winning the war, but in developing military approaches that minimized damage while maintaining professional standards under extreme political pressure. This may be a more modest legacy than some admirers claim, but it represents a different kind of military excellence. The controversy over Abrams' Vietnam record also reflects broader questions about how military effectiveness should be measured in conflicts that don't end with clear victory or defeat. Traditional metrics of military success proved inadequate for evaluating performance in Vietnam, and historians continue to struggle with developing appropriate analytical frameworks. Beyond the official records and formal histories, Abrams' personality and leadership style revealed themselves through countless small interactions with subordinates, allies, and even enemies. These human details provide insights into how exceptional military leaders actually function under extreme stress. Soldiers who served under Abrams consistently described his ability to remember individual names, personal circumstances, and professional concerns of officers far below him in the chain of command. This wasn't just good politics. It reflected genuine interest in the people whose lives depended on his decisions. In an institution where senior officers often became isolated from operational realities, Abrams maintained direct connections with working-level personnel. His communication style was notably different from stereotypical military commanders. Rather than relying on dramatic rhetoric or inspirational speeches, Abrams typically spoke quietly and chose his words carefully. Subordinates learned to listen closely when he spoke, knowing that casual comments often contained important guidance or insights. Vietnamese officials who worked with Abrams during the war later described him as one of the few American commanders who seemed genuinely interested in understanding Vietnamese perspectives rather than simply imposing American solutions. This cultural sensitivity was rare among senior American military leaders and contributed significantly to his operational effectiveness. Intelligence officers who briefed Abrams noted his exceptional ability to synthesize complex information from multiple sources and identify patterns that others missed. He consistently asked probing questions that revealed gaps in intelligence collection or analysis, and he insisted on understanding the political and cultural context of military operations. The general's personal habits also set him apart from many senior officers. He maintained the same austere living standards throughout his career, showing little interest in the privileges and perquisites of rank. His quarters, whether in Germany, Vietnam, or Washington, were notably simple and functional rather than prestigious or comfortable. Abrams's relationship with the media was complex and often misunderstood. Unlike some commanders who courted publicity or others who avoided it entirely, he developed selective relationships with journalists who demonstrated serious interest in understanding military operations, rather than simply generating dramatic stories. This approach sometimes created tensions with public relations officers who preferred more conventional media strategies. Perhaps most significantly, Abrams maintained extensive private correspondence with former subordinates throughout his career, providing mentorship and guidance long after formal command relationships had ended. These letters reveal a leader who viewed talent development as one of his primary responsibilities and who continued to influence military thinking through the officers he had trained and inspired. The institutional changes that Abrams initiated as Chief of Staff fundamentally shaped the contemporary American military in ways that extend far beyond Vietnam War lessons. His vision of professional military service influenced recruitment, training, leadership development, and organizational culture for decades after his death. The all-volunteer army that emerged under Abrams' guidance represented more than just the elimination of conscription. It reflected a comprehensive reimagining of military service as a professional career rather than a civic obligation. This transformation required new approaches to compensation, housing, family support, and career development that continue to influence military personnel policies. Abrams's emphasis on professional military education helped establish the contemporary system of intermediate and senior service schools that prepare officers for increasing levels of responsibility. He recognized that modern military operations required officers who could think strategically across multiple domains rather than simply executing tactical missions competently. The integration of conventional and special operations forces that characterized Abrams' Vietnam Command became a permanent feature of American military organization. Current Joint Operations Doctrine reflects many of the coordination mechanisms and command relationships that he pioneered during the Southeast Asian conflict. His approach to civil-military relations established precedents that continue to influence how senior military leaders interact with political authorities, media organizations, and public constituencies. The model of professional military advice that he represented, competent, politically aware, but institutionally neutral, remains the standard for contemporary general officers. The emphasis on cultural awareness and language training that Abrams promoted during Vietnam evolved into systematic programs for preparing military personnel for operations in diverse international environments. Current pre-deployment training reflects lessons learned from his recognition that military effectiveness often depends on understanding local political and social dynamics. Perhaps most importantly, Abrams contributed to the development of American counterinsurgency doctrine that has influenced military operations from Central America to the Middle East. While his specific Vietnam strategies proved insufficient for achieving American political objectives, the conceptual frameworks he developed provided foundations for subsequent military thinking about irregular warfare. The contemporary American military's emphasis on joint operations, interagency cooperation, and integration with allied forces reflects institutional learning that began under Abrams' leadership. His recognition that modern conflicts require coordination across multiple organizations and national boundaries has become a fundamental principle of current military doctrine. Modern officer evaluation systems, leadership training programs, and professional development opportunities reflect Abrams' belief that military effectiveness ultimately depends on the quality of individual leaders, rather than technological superiority or numerical advantages. His legacy continues through the institutional mechanisms that identify, develop, and promote military talent. The transformation of the American Army from a conscript force focused on conventional warfare to a professional organization capable of diverse operations represents perhaps Abrams's most significant institutional contribution. The volunteer military that emerged under his leadership has proven adaptable to conflicts and missions that he could never have anticipated, testament to the soundness of the foundational changes he initiated. When American forces crossed into Iraq in 2003 and deployed to Afghanistan following 9/11, they carried with them doctrinal frameworks that traced their origins directly back to Abrams's innovations in Vietnam. The counterinsurgency principles he pioneered, emphasizing population security over enemy elimination, integration with local forces, and precision operations rather than massive firepower, became the foundation for American military strategy in both theaters. The early years of Operation Iraqi Freedom revealed what happened when these lessons were ignored. Initial American strategy focused on conventional military victory, followed by rapid transition to Iraqi control. essentially reversecting Abrams' recognition that military success required sustained political and social development. The insurgency that emerged after the fall of Baghdad demonstrated the continuing relevance of his Vietnam-era insights about the political dimensions of military operations. General David Petraeus, who led the development of contemporary counterinsurgency doctrine, explicitly acknowledged the influence of Abrams' approach on modern military thinking. The 2006 Counterinsurgency Field Manual that guided American operations during the Iraq Surge incorporated many principles that Abrams had developed 40 years earlier. The primacy of political objectives, the importance of cultural understanding, and the recognition that military force alone could never achieve lasting stability. Violence dropped by more than 75% in Iraq, following implementation of surge strategy that emphasized population protection and integration with local security forces. Precisely the approach that Abrams had advocated in Vietnam. The difference was that Iraq provided more favorable political conditions for implementing these methods effectively. Afghanistan presented a more complex test of Abrams's legacy. Counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan focused on raising, training, and equipping host nation security forces, creating Afghan security forces that were reliant on long-term American support, an approach that directly reflected his Vietnamization concept. However, the cultural and political challenges in Afghanistan proved even more intractable than those he had faced in Southeast Asia. The institutional learning that occurred between Vietnam and the post-9/11 conflicts reflected both the value and limitations of Abrams' innovations. The new Army-Marine counterinsurgency doctrine, for example, is the product of a nearly unprecedented degree of internal debate, external vetting, historical analysis, and direct recent combat experience. Exactly the kind of systematic approach to military adaptation that Abrams had championed. Yet critics argued that in important ways, it makes underlying assumptions about the nature of counterinsurgency that made it an awkward fit for conditions in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The fundamental challenge that Abrams had identified, how to achieve political objectives through military means when local populations remain divided about fundamental questions of legitimacy and governance, remained as difficult as ever. Modern military leaders studying Abrams' approach found valuable guidance in his methods for maintaining professional standards and institutional integrity under extreme political pressure. His example demonstrated how military commanders could provide honest professional advice while remaining politically neutral, a model that proved especially relevant during controversial conflicts with unclear objectives and limited public support. The emphasis on cultural awareness and language training that characterized modern military deployments reflected lessons learned from Abrams's recognition that successful operations require deep understanding of local conditions. The average soldier must not only be faster and stronger, but smarter, a principle that guided both his Vietnam command and subsequent American military education reforms. Perhaps most significantly, the integration of conventional and special operations forces that became standard in Iraq and Afghanistan reflected organizational innovations that Abrams had pioneered decades earlier. His recognition that complex conflicts required coordination across multiple capabilities and organizations provided the conceptual foundation for modern joint operations doctrine. The question that haunts military historians and Vietnam veterans alike centers on timing. What might have happened if Creighton Abrams had been given command of American forces earlier in the conflict? The counterfactual scenarios that emerge from this speculation reveal both the potential and the limitations of individual leadership in shaping historical outcomes. If Abrams had replaced William Westmoreland in 1965 rather than 1968, he would have inherited a fundamentally different strategic situation. American ground forces were just beginning their major commitment to Vietnam. South Vietnamese military capabilities remained largely untested, and American public support for the war effort remained relatively strong. These conditions might have provided more favorable circumstances for implementing his population-centered approach to counterinsurgency. The early implementation of Vietnamization strategy could potentially have avoided the massive American troop buildup that ultimately reached over 500,000 personnel. Abrams' emphasis on developing South Vietnamese capabilities from the beginning, rather than as an exit strategy, might have created more sustainable security arrangements that didn't require such extensive American involvement. His recognition of the war's political dimensions might have led to different relationships with the South Vietnamese government and more effective integration of military operations with political and economic development programs. The corruption and inefficiency that undermined South Vietnamese legitimacy might have been addressed more systematically if American strategy had focused on these issues from the beginning, rather than treating them as secondary concerns. However, alternative history must also acknowledge the structural constraints that limited any commander's options in Vietnam. The fundamental problems that ultimately contributed to American failure, the questionable legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government, North Vietnamese willingness to sustain unlimited casualties, the complexity of fighting a limited war against an enemy committed to total victory, would have challenged even Abrams's exceptional capabilities. The domestic political constraints that shaped American strategy would have been equally limiting regardless of military leadership. Congressional oversight, media criticism, and public opinion dynamics that eventually undermined support for the war effort reflected deeper questions about American objectives and methods that no military commander could have resolved through tactical innovations alone. Moreover, the regional and international dimensions of the Vietnam conflict extended far beyond any single commander's sphere of influence. Chinese and Soviet support for North Vietnam, the broader Cold War context that shaped American strategic objectives, and the decolonization dynamics that influenced regional politics would have constrained Abrams's options, just as they limited his predecessors. Perhaps the most realistic counterfactual scenario involves not dramatic changes in war outcomes, but rather different patterns of military and political development that might have better prepared American institutions for subsequent conflicts. Earlier implementation of Abrams' approaches might have accelerated the institutional learning that eventually produced more effective counterinsurgency doctrine for later conflicts. The social and cultural changes within the American military that resulted from Vietnam experiences might have occurred differently under alternative leadership patterns. Abrams's emphasis on professional development and institutional integrity could potentially have mitigated some of the morale and discipline problems that affected American forces during the war's later phases. Some military historians argue that earlier appointment of Abrams might have changed the trajectory of civil-military relations during the Vietnam era. His approach to working with political authorities while maintaining professional independence could have provided different models for managing the tensions between military effectiveness and political constraints that characterized the entire conflict. The ultimate question remains whether different military leadership could have overcome the fundamental mismatch between American political objectives and the means that political leaders were willing to employ. Abrams's own recognition of this dilemma suggests that even his exceptional capabilities might not have been sufficient to bridge such fundamental strategic contradictions. The physical manifestations of Creighton Abrams' legacy extend far beyond the tank that bears his name, creating a network of memorials and institutional remembrances that reflect different aspects of his contributions to American military development. These monuments reveal how military institutions preserve and transmit the lessons of exceptional leadership across generations. Fort Knox, Kentucky, served as the home of the United States Army Armor School for decades, becoming the institutional heart of American armored warfare doctrine. The base that trained generations of tank crews and armor officers became synonymous with Abrams' legacy, even though the Armor School moved to Fort Benning in 2010 as part of the United States Base Realignment and Closure Program. During its time at Fort Knox, the Armor School trained more than 300,000 soldiers and Marines, each of whom learned not just technical skills, but also leadership principles that traced their origins to Abrams's approach to command. The Armor School is known around the globe as an educational opportunity not to be missed, with 50 different countries sending their armor officers to Fort Knox for courses, testament to the international recognition of American expertise in armored warfare doctrine. The transition of the Armor School from Fort Knox to Fort Benning marked the end of an era, but also demonstrated the institutional adaptability that Abrams had always emphasized. Out of the 280 armor artifacts, there will be 48 left on Fort Knox to continue the armor legacy and tell its story. These pieces will remain at the gates, key intersections, the traffic circle, and even some of the vehicles outside the museum, ensuring that future generations would understand the historical significance of the installation. The M1 Abrams tank itself functions as a mobile memorial, with each of the thousands of tanks bearing his name serving as a reminder of his contributions to armored warfare doctrine. Unlike static monuments, these memorials continue to serve operational purposes, embodying the principle that the best tribute to military leaders lies in the continued effectiveness of the institutions and capabilities they help develop. Military installations throughout the United States feature buildings, ranges, and training facilities named in honor of Abrams, creating a distributed network of institutional memory that keeps his example alive for working military professionals. These naming decisions reflect not just historical recognition, but also ongoing relevance of his leadership principles to contemporary military operations. The most significant memorial to Abrams may be found not in bronze and stone, but in the curriculum of military education institutions, where his approach to command continues to be studied and taught. The Command and General Staff College, the Army War College, and similar institutions incorporate case studies of his leadership into programs designed to develop future military commanders. Professional military education has institutionalized many of the leadership principles that characterized Abrams's approach. Emphasis on cultural awareness, integration of military operations with political objectives, and the development of subordinate leaders capable of independent decision-making. These educational programs represent living memorials that continue to influence military thinking decades after his death. The international dimension of Abrams' memorial legacy reflects the global influence of American military doctrine and training. Foreign officers who attended the Armor School at Fort Knox carried his leadership principles back to their own military institutions, creating an international network of influence that extends far beyond American borders. Contemporary military leaders who never served under Abrams directly nonetheless consider themselves part of his professional lineage through the institutional traditions and doctrinal frameworks that he helped establish. This form of memorial, the transmission of professional values and methods through generations of military leaders, may represent the most lasting tribute to his contributions. The challenge facing institutions that seek to preserve Abrams' legacy lies in maintaining the substance of his contributions while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. Military technology, geopolitical conditions, and social contexts have changed dramatically since his era, but the fundamental leadership principles he exemplified remain relevant to modern military professionals. Modern memorial efforts increasingly focus on capturing not just the historical facts of Abrams' career, but also the thinking processes and decision-making frameworks that made him effective under diverse and challenging circumstances. This approach reflects recognition that his greatest contribution lay not in specific tactical innovations, but in demonstrating how exceptional leaders adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining professional integrity. The enduring challenge for those who study Abrams's legacy lies in distinguishing between the methods he used, which may be historically specific, and the principles he embodied, which remain relevant across different eras and contexts. The memorials and educational programs that preserve his memory must navigate this distinction to provide useful guidance for contemporary military leaders facing their own unprecedented challenges. In an age of rapid technological change and evolving strategic environments, the memorial legacy of Creighton Abrams serves as a reminder that leadership effectiveness ultimately depends less on mastering specific techniques than on maintaining the intellectual flexibility, professional competence, and moral integrity that enable adaptation to unforeseen circumstances. His monuments are not just tributes to past achievement, but guides for future excellence in military service,